Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Maggie Lennon and it's Thursday the 22nd of April and here are the coronavirus statistics from 2 o'clock today. A total of 1,892,819 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 1,668,223 have been confirmed negative and 224,596 have tested positive. There are 231 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although remember, not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will have been tested. There were 3 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who've died from complications caused by the coronavirus COVID-19 infection now stands at 7,646. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 93 were in hospital last night, 12 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 o'clock this morning, 2,755,175 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination and 898,231 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show 127,327 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 22 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings and not just in hospitals. As of the 18th of April, 10,055 deaths have been registered in Scotland, where the coronavirus COVID-19 was mentioned on the death certificate, according to statistics published by the National Records of Scotland today. In the week 12th to 18th of April, 24 deaths were registered that mentioned COVID-19 on the death certificate, a decrease of 10 deaths from the previous week. The number of weekly deaths due to COVID-19 are now at their lowest since October of last year. There were 7 deaths in Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board area, 5 in Lanarkshire and 4 in Ayrshire and Arran. I'm joined this evening by Kate Monahan, a disability and equality rights activist and co-founder of the charity Because We Matter. Good evening, Kate, and thanks for joining us. What do you make of these recent statistics on the coronavirus?
Hi, thank you for having me. Well, I hope that, we all hope that the vaccination program's now beginning to have an impact on the cases and the outcomes, and long may it continue to be so, although I keep hearing and reading about a potential next wave, later in the year maybe. So I hope everybody still is careful and aware that there still is a risk, and we all need to respect that. But it's great to hear that they're going down all the time. It's nice news.
There is a natural nervousness, I think, as things open up. I'm not planning to rush off to any pub or restaurant anytime soon, to be honest. I think I'll take it slowly. Turning to the election, the Labour Party launched their manifesto today. Anas Sarwar said that he wanted his party to transcend the constitutional battle between the Scottish National Party and the Tories by focusing instead on a national recovery plan. The Labour proposals, forecast to cost £4.5 billion over the next year, include £500 million a year on building 120,000 new zero-carbon rental homes over the next decade, £147 million this summer on providing free sports, arts, transport and activities to school children, with £131 million on a tutoring school catch-up programme. £300 million to deal with the huge backlog in operations, cancer treatments and medical appointments delayed by the pandemic. £341 million on offering every adult, a £75 voucher to spend in high street shops. £400 million on ensuring full employment and retraining including giving everyone under 25 or unemployed who is not already on an employment scheme a job in the public sector. Responding to the Labour manifesto, SNP Deputy Leader Keith Brown said that the party was completely out of touch with its own supporters and with Scotland, and is leaving the key decisions about the country's future in the hands of the Tories. An Ipsos Mori poll published earlier this week found that 2/3 of the 219 UK Labour voters would support a referendum if a pro-independence majority is returned at the election. In a move which has heaped further pressure on the Scottish Labour leader, his Welsh counterpart, Mark Drakeford, recently said he has always believed that if a party won an election in Wales with a referendum on independence in its manifesto, then it would have won the right to hold such a referendum. I'm just wondering, Kate, if there's anything in that large shopping list that appeals to you particularly?
Well, just to address your opening position on it, I think it's a false dichotomy that Labour is setting up to suggest that you can either have a constitutional debate or you can have a recovery over here, ignoring the national conversation that's going on. And one thing I don't understand about Labour's position, but also all the Unionist Party positions, is none of them seem to see the opportunity of an independence referendum as a moment they could reinvent themselves as a party for a future Scotland. It tends to be seen as a sort of I guess that the SNP is independence, which of course it is the lead party campaigning for independence. But let's never forget, and I think the Unionist parties do, that a referendum is just a choice for the people, a choice before the people, and it's equally open to Labour, to the Tories, to all the other parties to make a positive case for the union, to argue if they want to and can for their position. And I find it very a strange position for them to be in, to avoid what's basically a democratic process, a moment, a conversation that they've in effect stepped back from and discounted themselves in. So if Scotland goes forward with a majority, which it looks from the polling that it will, behind at least the SNP and or an SNP Green coalition, i.e. a majority for independence, the Unionist parties have left themselves outside of that discussion and outside of that. And I think that politically that's rather foolish, and I don't really understand why they don't want to be part of that conversation. If they think the union's so wonderful, tell us, explain to us why they hold that position. So I think fundamentally for me, they're having a conversation over there in the corner, whereas the rest of the nation is having a central conversation that they're putting their heads in the sand a little bit.
And this time round, Labour has made it clear that should there be a referendum, so at least some of them are thinking it might actually happen, that they wouldn't be prepared to kind of get back into bed with the Conservatives in a kind of better together coalition again. So that would be quite interesting, because you'd have these three, if you include the Lib Dems, three sort of sets of voices shouting for the union. And presumably the fact that that message is going to be fragmented would also weaken the argument for the union. And it is a shift, isn't it, from when David Cameron agreed for the first referendum, where he did see it as a very positive way for the union to make its case, and we can argue whether it was done in a positive way or not. But, and clearly they won their argument that time round. But I'm just wondering if there was anything that's been unveiled today by Labour for their plans in the highly unlikely case that they should form a government that makes you think, actually, that's quite an interesting idea. That's something that maybe SNP or other parties could support.
I mean, I think the idea of affordable homes, and I know the SNP themselves have got 100,000 new ones in their own manifesto, and the Greens are very conscious about sustainable future homes. And I think that whole question about, how do we still have any homeless people in the fifth richest economy in the world, which is an astonishing thing. And it was quite demonstrable at the beginning of COVID, when within a weekend they'd actually taken all the homeless people off the streets. They no longer were there on the streets. And actually, we can do that. So it is a question of political will. So for me, housing, the green agenda, we only have on a bigger level this one home, which is the planet. And if we don't do enough now, there's a legacy element to that. What our generation, what are the people here on this small blue planet do now may make the difference to whether or not it's a livable in home for all people forever going forward. So that's huge for me as well.
Well, it's a good message today, Kate, because of course today is Earth Day, and to mark that, as the world looks forward to COP26 in Glasgow, the SNP has unveiled its environmental manifesto, which is on top of its main manifesto, launched recently. And this outlines the party's commitment to ending Scotland's contribution to climate change by 2045. The mini manifesto pledges to increase progress towards becoming a net zero nation by investing record amounts in tackling the climate crisis and our climate change plan, updated with 100 new policies. To use Scotland's role at COP26 to help secure a Glasgow agreement that sees all countries commit to taking the action needed to tackle the climate crisis and appoint environmental champions to advise the government. Publish a document on Scotland's world-leading target to reduce emissions by 75% by 2030 and double our climate justice fund to £24 million. Invest an additional £500 million in our natural economy, publish a strategy to tackle the biodiversity crisis, and remain committed to protecting at least 30% of Scotland's land and a 10-year investment of more than £250 million to support the restoration of 250,000 hectares of Scottish peatland by 2030. Increase targets for new woodland creation by 50%, from 12,000 hectares up to 18,000 hectares per year by 2025. Decarbonise the heating of 1 million homes by 2030, and all new homes and buildings from 2024 will use renewable or zero emissions heating. This is backed by a £1.6 million investment. Revolutionise our transport system by reducing the use of cars, measured as car kilometres, by 20% by 2030. Phase out petrol and diesel vehicles by 2030. Provide free bikes for all pupils who cannot afford them. Remove the majority of fossil fuel buses from public transport by 2023 and create a greener, public-owned railway. Shift half of farming and crofting funding from unconditional to conditional support with green strings and support the development of low-carbon vertical farms. Bring forward a circular economy bill to promote reuse of products and reduce waste. Take action to ban single-use plastic cutlery, implement the deposit return scheme, and create a fund for innovation in tackling textile pollution. The SNP has also committed to making the most of Scotland's massive potential in its new hydrogen sector, vowed it will not support fracking, and promised to support carbon-neutral islands, which would include pilots for some islands to run on 100% renewable energy to create circular economies, tackling and processing waste, and exploring more sustainable transport options. That's quite a list. I'm not sure I know what a vertical farm is. Maybe someone will tweet in and tell us. Again, a lot of money put out there. Some of this was announced in the main manifesto. I think it's just highlighting the key elements because of the day it is today. And also, I read today that there's, for the first time, a US-based company called Ampere, I think, are going to try the first hybrid electric flight in Scotland from Orkney to Caithness. They've been having some success in the west coast of America. So, is it going to save the planet, Kate?
I'm afraid I don't have a definitive answer to that, but it's got to be a good direction of travel, hasn't it? And we have to start to take it seriously, understand it. I think a fair question to be asking candidates in this election is not just, do you believe in climate science, but do you understand it, and what will you do about it if you become an MSP? And these are the types of innovations that I think the whole world needs to be on board. I saw Boris Johnson today said that it wasn't about politically correct bunny hugging or something, the planet, which seems incredibly out of touch with the serious nature of the challenges that face us. And I think this is a fantastic list, as you say, an extensive and comprehensive list. There's a lot on there that I agree with. I love the vertical gardens things. I hope that vertical farming is a similar idea.
I think it must be, but I don't know for certain.
I know in
but,
Iceland they
but you,
farm on top of roofs and things under glass,
yeah,
and making the most of, we can all grow our own food in quite small spaces, and there's so much we can do. I mean, I live up in Aberdeenshire, and land management's a very divisive and controversial subject up here, actually, and it's a sort of thing that in more ways than one seems very out of date now in terms of how society's structured up here, but also in terms of green issues. And I think perhaps innovations in green tourism and things like that could really be helpful. So I hope that all sectors, all areas will look long and hard at what they can be doing to help keep the planet safe and habitable for as long as possible.
there's a couple of things that you've mentioned we'll pick up on. So I agree with you. I think as well as all the proposals that are about decarbonising the economy, I do think land management is critical to this. And it is a sensitive issue in Scotland. There's a lot of work needing done. The SNP have proposed plans for what they are calling radical land management and land reform. I'm not sure everybody who's a land reform activist would agree that it's as radical as it needs to be.
Yeah.
And I'm also interested in the idea of being able to grow your own food. I mean, I think that would be a really radical and key thing if anybody who wanted to grow their own food was given space to do that, because that's not the case. We know there's long lists, waiting lists for people who want to get on allotments and things. And yet
Yes.
over COVID and during the pandemic, quite a lot of people, have been growing tomatoes on balconies and all sorts of things. So do you think that's something that we should be pushing for? Grow our own food and the right to do it?
I'd like to think so, not least because, mass farming techniques have added to the loss of bees, and their habitats have been changed. And it's the commercialization of our food production. Sort of raising dairy herds is one of the most problematic things in the green agenda that you can do. So if we can remove our dependency on sort of big farms and start to have smaller farms that have a better local footprint and extend that out into the communities. There's a brilliant communal garden in a village nearby, and people use it like mini allotments with raised beds, and it's been fantastic for people in COVID because it's outdoors. They can keep 2 meters apart, but they're not socially isolated. It's accessible to disabled people. It has a composting toilet, and they share produce. So if somebody grows too many carrots and somebody else grows too many spring onions, they just swap a few. And I feel like almost, in some ways we need to go back past the sort of 17th century that much of the land ownership estate grouse moor stuff feels very embedded in, and look almost to local village communities, a kind of supportive, collaborative approach to food production. So each family might not need to produce just their own food, but food to barter, food to share, food for each other. And we know about all the chemical impacts, and our oceans and our air now, it seems, are full of all these microbead plastic elements that are tiny. We're breathing them in all the time. We've had the first death in the UK of a little girl from pollution. So we have to just take it seriously. People can't just say, well, my hobby is to shoot this one species of bird, so I kill everything else around and clear the land. And I think it has to be taken on as being out of date, because it is out of date. We're in a climate emergency, and although traditions are wonderful in many ways, if they're harmful, and if we need to change them, I think somebody has to have the political boldness to take that on. And it won't be easy, but I think it does need to be
Yeah,
done.
well, nothing worth achieving is necessarily easy. And I think the sorts of things you're talking about there around, especially about food production and things, are the sorts of green measures that a lot of people can get on board with and understand. And you said earlier that we should be asking candidates not just what they plan to do, but do they understand the issues? And for a lot of us who are not environmentalists from a kind of scientific point of view, who don't necessarily fully understand the whole decarbonising agenda and all of that, the sorts of things you're talking about, the green suggestions of how we improve our life, how we get communities back to being very involved and central to the way that we live, I think has a big opportunity to change people's minds. And I think always trying to look at something positive from COVID, because heavens, it's been the most horrific thing to have happened to the world. But that going back to communities, falling back on communities, the strength of communities really is something that could be taken forward. So all the chat about and all the predictions about building back better, maybe it's about building back locally and building back smaller. Small isn't necessarily bad. As a petite person of
I,
5'2", I would say
I
that, wouldn't
think,
I?
if I can just briefly
Uh,
add, I think there's a saying about the world can give us what everybody needs, not what everybody wants. And I think we've got to start to take responsibility as citizens for what we're doing in our behaviours. And just for one final example of the type of thing that needs to change is the drinking water story that I'm sure you've seen recently, where in England, where the water supplies were privatised, they are now just the reports have shown the physical evidence exists that they've been dumping raw sewage into rivers. And so if we commercialise essential things like water, these types of negative impact behaviours in the pursuit of profit damage all of us, our environment, ourselves. And in Scotland that hasn't happened yet, but the internal market bill is a threat to Scotland's autonomy to decide to have a non sort of commodified water system, and they have a right to direct, and my understanding is they have a right to directly purchase the production of our water in Scotland. Another reason to support independence in my view. But so these types of things, how do we protect our natural capital, our natural heritage, the things that we need essential to life? How do we protect them so we can keep them clean, not be at the mercy of these sort of profiteering companies? I think
and our
those sorts
natural
of things.
capital is hugely important to Scotland. I mean, it is part of our
Absolutely.
wealth in every regard and the health and
That's
well-being of our people. The
complete.
Scottish Greens today, for their Earth Day announcement, was to pledge to introduce a new rail card for Scots to immediately bring down the cost of rail fares for everyone who lives here. The Scottish rail card would be modelled on the existing network rail card in the southeast of England, designed to encourage people to take the train rather than drive by reducing the cost of off-peak journeys by a third. Scottish Greens co-leader Patrick Harvie said, "The Scottish Greens are committed to making public transport the preferred choice for all our communities to reduce the reliance on private cars. We've already won free bus travel for all people under 22 this year, and we want to introduce concessionary travel on publicly owned railways too. If we're going to tackle transport emissions and ensure a green recovery from the pandemic, we need to be proactive in boosting public transport." Slight problem is the bus concessions are great, but buses go on roads, and there are a lot of roads in Scotland that go everywhere. The trains don't go everywhere. There are huge parts of Scotland that you just can't reach by rail. So it seems, again, it's very central belt based. It's not particularly helping remote areas of the Highlands. I mean, even up where you live, I mean,
Yeah.
there's not that much train availability really. I know Inverurie quite well, and I know the line from Aberdeen to Inverurie is always being dug up, so you can't even promise to get there. So do you think this is a do you think this is a bit? It felt to me a bit of a gimmick, maybe.
Mm, I know what you mean. There is up here in the northeast. There's a campaign at the moment to get a more connected local railway service into play. So I wish it well. um, but we do need to look again at our own behaviours. And one thing I think COVID has taught us is that we don't all need to travel about to work, to engage with each other. I'm speaking to you now from the northeast. At one time, I would have travelled down there. We'd have both been together. So, although there's a downside to that, there's also a benefit. And I hope that businesses in particular will look differently at how they allow and expect employees to travel, to commute, to be in the office. Is it necessary, etc. And we look at journeys as more exceptional rather than necessarily part of our daily grind, if you like, that we sort of look at it a little bit differently. But I don't know about trains. I don't know enough about them. My understanding is they're still quite polluting themselves at the moment, and maybe there's a better future version that will be less polluting. But obviously cars, if we can go down the hydro route, that'll be great. But I think there's quite a lot to that I'm not adequately qualified to talk about. But I do like the Greens' radical policies. I like the radical social justice policies, and again, their policies about land ownership and land management and rewilding and that type of thing. That's quite exciting and innovative. So I guess the bottom line is, as long as we're having these conversations, we're addressing these issues, we will find solutions as a community, I hope.
Well, Nicola Sturgeon, keeping on the idea of keeping people out of cars, has said that she will kickstart a revolution in active travel. She's pledged to help
Yeah.
kickstart that revolution and capitalise on the uptake in cycling seen during the pandemic. Speaking on the campaign visit to Glasgow as the world marks Earth Day, the First Minister underlined the SNP's determination to foster positive habits from the youngest age by providing free bikes to all children of school age who could not otherwise afford one. For everyone else, an SNP government will make loans and grants available for the purchase and repair of pedal cycles. Other headline SNP commitments include a pledge to ensure that £1 in every £10 of the transport capital budget is spent on walking, wheeling and cycling by the end of the Parliament, as well as developing a Scotland-wide active travel network to ensure every town has access to a high-quality and separated walking and cycling network. That has to be also good for the nation's health, to get people back out walking. Now, we've all been doing a lot of walking since COVID. At one point, especially in the first lockdown, it felt that it was almost, you had to go out for your hour's walk. It wasn't, it'd be a good idea. You must go out for your hour's walk. And I know lots of people who are, the couch and couch potato, who just walking wasn't something they ever did, who really embraced that and have continued doing it. The rise of cycling has increased. So that has to be a good thing, doesn't it? Leaving aside the emissions, if it gets people active, that has to help with the health of Scotland. We are the sick man of Europe, after all.
I think it absolutely is, and Europe's a good place to bring this conversation, because Europe is absolutely fabulous at creating bike-safe spaces, and that has to be part of this. It's no good giving children bikes and then they have to ride along a main road. It's too dangerous. So I hope that with this policy will come a sort of approach to create actual a network of bike roadways, I suppose, like the Europeans have, like many of Austrian places have wonderful ones that are wide. They're covered with wildflowers and greenery, and there's cafe culture along them. Families go together and all of that, and perhaps that's a way forward. And certainly I think we could do more in our villages and towns to create sort of car-free zones, and plant food, planters, grow food, grow flowers, green up the space and improve them. I don't know if you know Inverurie, you probably know Aberdeen, and Aberdeen is such a sorry city because the main Union Street is absolutely beautiful if you look up at the buildings from the top, but on the ground level, it's really quite grim and sad and many empty. It could be a fabulously vibrant space with the right vision and creativity, and I think those are the ways forward. And if people walk and if they cycle, they're much more engaged with the environment they pass through. That's what research shows, whereas in your car you're removed from it, so you notice there aren't any bees, there aren't enough birds, that we're losing these things, and that can only be good as well. But yeah, I think there'll be many happy children and good.
Absolutely. And you mentioned vision, and I'm all for having vision in our politicians. And of course, depending who wins the election will depend whose vision we're enjoying for the next 5 years. The polls show that the SNP are still ahead, but that getting their majority might be at risk. Polls in the Scotsman and the Times show that the SNP's ability to form a majority government led by Nicola Sturgeon as First Minister is in doubt, as although their constituency vote is holding up, they've lost some support on the regional list. Meanwhile, Labour and the Tories continue in the battle for second place, with Scottish Tory leader Douglas Ross's personal approval ratings plummeting by 12 points to minus 33, and 51% of those polled saying he's doing a bad job. SNP Deputy Leader Keith Brown said that it was clear that only the SNP has a serious plan for government and ambitious plans for Scotland's recovery. Mr Brown said that the SNP is taking absolutely nothing for granted at this election. Every seat counts and every vote counts, and his party are working harder than ever to guarantee an SNP government with a strong leadership to lead Scotland through the pandemic, kickstart Scotland's economy, and improve lives across the country. It's a strange poll that's come out today because it looks like everybody's vote is collapsing except the Conservatives, which just doesn't feel genuine in Scotland. I know that the Conservatives have increased their majority in England from 7% to 14%, which leaves my scratching my head. But this seems a bit odd. So not only have SNP's vote collapsed, so have the Greens a little. Alba are polling at something like 1% to 2%. So it's not that the regional seats are going to go from SNP to them. So are polls helpful, Kate? Should we just not bother?
That is a very good question. I mean, they have traditionally been wrong, I think, in every election, certainly up to 2010. In general elections, they've been wrong. And, I think there's a danger that there is as much about leading behaviour as reflecting behaviour. And if people vote for, voter research on voter behaviour shows that people vote for the people that they believe will act in their best interests or best reflect who they are and what they want. But also people like to vote for winners. So if you tell somebody that somebody's going to win or somebody's going to lose, it does actually have a statistical impact to a degree on what happens. But so I think polls, you've always got to take them with a little bit of a pinch of salt. I think for me, what's interesting about this one is I think it's the Conservative vote is what it is, and it's very consolidated. They're very good at getting it out, and it's the same people all the time, and they don't change their minds. And what's kind of more interesting is what's maybe happening is that the left of centre, more progressive conversation is a bit more multifaceted, because Labour do seem to be enjoying a little bit of a surge under their new leader, but equally 40% of them are supposedly in favour of independence. So they've got that struggle. The Greens, I hope, and it looks like we'll get some more seats in this parliament, which I think is good. As you know, Holyrood is intended to be a collaborative governance structure. It's not meant to lend itself to any majority. So perhaps it's just playing out as it's meant to be. And the list voting system, it's interesting. It's very different. And if it was just a first past the post result like the Westminster elections, it would be a very different parliament. So I think that the Conservative vote probably won't shift. I don't think it'll go up or down. I think it's everything else that's moving, but I may well be very wrong.
It's a good point that you make, though. The Scottish Parliament, of course, was designed not to ever have a majority. There's only ever been one majority government. That was the 2011 government. And that whole agenda of discussing the majority is very media-led, and it is very media-led with that. They haven't quite got their head around that. And of course, the added thing is the argument that unless there's an SNP majority government with an all-out majority, that weakens their mandate for a referendum, whereas they don't think that's necessarily true. They would like a majority, but they think that a majority of independent supporting parties gives them a mandate. They've had that mandate, of course. They've had that mandate for a long time. And it's not just if it was first past the post, it would be different. If it was fully proportional representation, it would be a different looking government. And I think although our regional system is easy enough to understand when you're actually voting, I think trying to predict or understand how that's actually going to pan out is pretty difficult. You need to be pretty good at maths to work out. I've had it explained to me often with many diagrams, and I still scratch my head. The UK government cuts have led to a 63% rise in food bank parcels handed out in Scotland over 5 years, with one emergency food parcel handed out to a child every 7 minutes this year, according to shocking new statistics provided by the Trussell Trust. Trussell Trust food banks in Scotland have handed out around 220,000 emergency food parcels between April 2020 and March 2021. A parcel every 2.5 minutes. More than 77,000 parcels went to children. Across the UK, the Trussell Trust network gave out a record 2.5 million emergency food parcels in the last year, more than 980,000 of those going to children. Almost 2 parcels on average every minute, and a 128% rise compared to this time 5 years ago. It's the first time the number of food parcels distributed in the UK has topped 2 million. Kate, you said earlier that having homeless people on the streets is a disgrace in the 5th largest economy in the world, but surely this is the real disgrace.
It's absolutely shocking. And I think, it's just not acceptable. So at what point do the people in government, become accountable for this as an ongoing situation? Boris Johnson's twice now been shamed into having to act on this by a footballer who is a hero, in my view, in modern times, but shouldn't have to lead a campaign to feed children in this wealthy country that we live in. And for me, this goes right to the heart of the current sleaze Tory corruption conversation. And if you're going to have a situation where Dido, Harding and Serco and Rupert Soames et al. Are benefiting to the tune of £37 billion for delivering nothing of any value in the third biggest infrastructure project on the planet, and at the same time, we are going to see these kinds of statistics about the poverty and this, affecting the most vulnerable in our society. The time has come to stop and to assess what we're doing. And I just think that, there's so many things we could do, but I would immediately stop tax evasion, close tax loops. Don't let these companies siphon off, asset strip what's effectively public money. The Tories are handing out under very murky procurement processes with no consequences whatsoever to their friends and family public money. And that public money is needed in the system to feed these children and to look after all of us, to house everybody, to heal people. You mentioned about the backlog in operations from COVID and things like that. Our NHS needs this money. So people should not be allowed to offshore wealth. I read a terrifying statistic that said that half of the world's wealth is in 9 individual pockets.
Mm-hmm.
And if we've got to that point, we've failed as a species. How have we allowed a system to stay, imposition that lets the 1% thrive, and they've gained so much extra wealth during COVID. That's another alarming statistic, to the point where we have starving children now. Charles Dickens would be absolutely turning in his grave that it's no better than this. They'll be back in the workhouse soon. It's disgraceful, and it makes me very angry, actually.
I think
Sorry.
raising the prospect of the workhouse is pretty accurate. Actually, it does feel that that's where we're headed. And talking about issues of tax evasion, I mean, some of the companies who've made the most money out of the pandemic, people like Amazon, are the ones that are still avoiding and evading paying tax. I think the thing about food banks that really irritates me is the fact that for an awful lot of politicians, they've just become accepted. They're just part of the landscape, so much so that people like Willie Rennie this week were being photographed standing next to people in food banks with a big
Yeah,
smile on his face. Now, I don't doubt that what he was saying was the people that work in food banks, who are, of course, doing an amazing job under difficult circumstances, should be applauded for that. But it's become almost accepted that food banks exist. And it's not often that you hear politicians of any party actually saying, no, no, our aim is to get rid of them altogether. So do you think that is possible, or are food banks here to stay?
they shouldn't be. We didn't used to have them. We don't need to have them. We are a wealthy enough country, if we share it more appropriately, for everyone to eat, and for everyone to be safe in a secure home, and for everyone to be made well. We can afford to do it. We've got to choose to do it, and it's up to us, the people, to demand it, to say this has got to stop. It's not sustain. We're back to sustainable. This isn't sustainable in another way, in that as a system it's broken and it's failing. And I think we should actually be out on the streets, although we're not allowed to be out on the streets. But we get the government we deserve, we get the systems we deserve, and we have to challenge these sorts of things. This is wrong. It's
It's
2021. We should not have children in poverty in modern Britain.
I think one of the
End of.
things I think one of the things that's really shocked me this week is so many people up in arms, really upset about the corruption in the football industry with the Super League, who don't give a monkeys about the corruption that's going on with their own politicians. So I think you're right. In
Absolutely.
many cases, we get the politicians that we deserve. But it's good
Yeah.
to mention one footballer who, as you say, is a hero. Looking to overseas now, North Carolina state officials have opened an investigation into the fatal shooting of a black man in his car by local sheriff deputies, serving him with a search warrant, authorities and local media reported yesterday. The shooting unfolded on Wednesday morning in Elizabeth City, a riverfront town of about 18,000 residents in Pasquotank County near North Carolina's coastal border with Virginia, and small groups of protesters took to the streets by evening. The County Sheriff's Office and the State Bureau of Investigation, which said it had taken over the case, each provided few details of the fatal encounter. Authorities identified the man who was slain as Andrew Brown Jr., a resident of Elizabeth City, and said only that he was shot when sheriff deputies tried to serve him with a search warrant at about 8:40 a.m. Law enforcement officials did not say whether Brown was armed at the time or whether he was considered a threat to the officers. The nature of the warrant was not disclosed. The shooting came the day after a jury found Derek Chauvin guilty of murdering George Floyd last year by kneeling on his neck while he was handcuffed and under arrest. Just goes to show, Kate, that despite the verdict for Shogun, which I have to say surprised me, I thought there'd be more of a fudge. I thought they might just find him guilty for manslaughter, but not guilty on all three charges. And despite Biden's announcement that he's going to instigate a federal investigation into policing, not just in Minneapolis, but across the states, it's going to take an awful lot more for black people to feel safe on the streets when they encounter white policemen, don't you think?
I absolutely do. It's terrible. I mean, it's tragic. I think there's so many threads that tie together, today on the sort of anniversary of the Stephen Lawrence case here, and, as you say, the verdict yesterday. And I think that I feel like a lack of faith in the system that had it been left to its own devices, as it were, he wouldn't actually have been found guilty of murder and he wouldn't now be facing the sentence that he is. I think that is directly a result of two things. One is that the incident was filmed, and so we all watched a murder. And several colleagues stood around and watched a murder. And these are people who are sworn to do no harm, to protect the public. So for me, it's not even just Chauvin himself, it's all of them that were present that should have intervened and could have stopped it in their sort of duty. And so I think that the fact that it was captured on camera is the power of it, because we know the truth, we saw the truth. So a fudge couldn't happen because we all witnessed it. There were plenty of moments along that terrible 9.5 minutes when it could have stopped. And also, I think the subsequent unrest, I think the Black Lives Matter campaign, I think the outpouring of anger, and that this isn't one incident. This is a whole long story of similar incidents. And so it was an accumulation as well. And I think all of those things came together, made what appeared yesterday to be a hopeful moment and perhaps an opportunity for change. And then this is just very depressing today. And it goes back to accountability again, in public life in all regards. This is a different kind of corruption. It's an abuse of power. And I hope that Biden will be a change for good, and Kamala Harris, I believe, will. But Obama wanted to be. I remember him in tears. The GRA, the gun lobby, is very, very powerful. It's big money. So we're back again to the profit, sort of having such influence. And it remains a country in which I fear these incidents are going to go on, at least at the moment.
Going back to the Chauvin verdicts just for a minute, was he convicted purely for the murder of George Floyd, or was he in fact convicted for the murder of every black man who's been murdered by a policeman or has had a death in custody? Do you think there was an element of the jury's decision? And I'm not suggesting that the jury were in any way derelict in their duty, but how much of that weighed, do you think, on the jury's shoulders? I mean, this was an immense pressure on them to do the right thing. And depending on what side you fell, the right thing was a different thing. So how much do you think it wasn't just about George Floyd? It was about all the other black men who've died in custody or been pulled over by the police, and then it's ended in a fatality.
I think it was the right verdict for the crime that we saw committed for ourselves. So in that sense, I think the jury did the right thing. But I agree that the context and the history and the bigger kind of societal problem that this is systemic, and this incident was sort of a moment of hopefully a pivotal moment for change, but it was accumulation of many things, must have to a degree contributed. But I think it's undeniable that he murdered him. He knew what he was doing. I mean, I don't know if you saw the doctor's report on what would be happening to his body with this knee on him, he was trying to protest that he couldn't breathe. The callousness, the dismissiveness, the lack of humanity demonstrated by him and his colleagues. And I think it was the right outcome and verdict by the jury, and probably brave of them in America to have made it, but right that they did. And yeah, the context is inextricable from that incident, but that incident stands alone for me as being.
And now that Chauvin has been convicted, of course, his co-officers are now facing charges, and they will be tried later. I think their trials are due to start in August.
Right.
I think part of the issue around the police in the United States is to do with the structure. So although there is the FBI, local police forces are literally local police forces. They're not even statewide police forces in some cases. There's quite a lot of autonomy within individual districts and individual sheriffdoms. I mean, I still think it's kind of funny. The sheriff is still quite important in the American justice system. And I think that's possibly one of the problems where individual people who are powerful or who are seen as inspirational or even just bullies. A lot has come out about the kind of man Chauvin was himself.
Yeah.
The system in the States, the fact that it isn't like here in Scotland where there is one police force, allows those individuals who have institutionalized racist views to have more sway amongst their colleagues, for example, and possibly obviously with public opinion. So unless that's tackled, I'm not sure you're going to see a huge change. And yet to tackle that would be to really cut across the power of the states, the individual states. And that's the real dilemma with everything in the United States. This contrast between federal power and state power. Biden is clearly, the big government Democrat who really is pushing federal power in a number of areas. So I don't know if you've any thoughts about that, of what what's going to have to happen around the structure of policing.
I think you're right on so many levels. I mean, I think the incident that you referred to today was actually the sheriff's office, wasn't it? So yes, an example of sheriff's officers, I suppose I should say. But yeah, and also they have this weird business of electing people all the time. So people that are judges, that are sheriffs, that are actually directly elected. So they're also operating in their own political interest all the time. And I think if you don't have law enforcement separate from political process, that's another very dangerous combination of things. But I think fundamentally we can't get away from the fact that, in America, a lot of the escalation of cases is to do with guns and gun ownership, because here we have police brutality. We've had some high-profile cases in Scotland ourselves. We've had deaths in custody that, there's an inquiry at the moment. And so I think that type of thing it happens here, but it isn't gun-led. And I think the guns on both sides is probably an escalating thing too. So one, the GRA shouldn't be political. It shouldn't have political influence. The president and everybody down should be separate and freed from the burden of that kind of degree of lobbying, but also take out elections from these local level, lower ranking jobs, and make things onto perhaps a more consistent basis across the states as a whole, if they can do that in some way. But America's like 52, is it 52, however many states, different countries, and so they've all got a different culture. Some are really very racist inherently as a society, and some are very modern, global, very mixed communities. So New York's nothing like the Deep South or the West Coast, and so it's a ginormous amount of country and land and people. So it's just not really comparable for us. I think we don't really have the same difficulties, but I'm glad at the moment that we predominantly keep guns out of the culture. But I think institutionalized racism in the police force here is another factor.
Well, you mentioned earlier that it's Stephen Lawrence Day today.
Yeah.
It's the 28th anniversary of his death. In The Guardian today, Diane Abbott wrote that Stephen Lawrence Day is a good opportunity to consider the importance of the Macpherson inquiry. 28 years after Stephen died, it's also a good time to contemplate where British society goes from here in the fight for racial justice. She wrote that the Macpherson report had 70 recommendations, but sadly, some of those important recommendations have yet to be implemented. She said the single most significant thing that the inquiry did was to label the official reaction to Stephen's killing institutionally racist. Sir William Macpherson said that the Metropolitan Police investigation had been undermined by professional incompetence, institutional racism, and a failure of leadership. it's important to remember what a seismic effect Macpherson's use of the phrase had. Some campaigners against racism had talked about the police and institutional racism for some time. But while it was one thing for black people to use the phrase, but for a white, then 72-year-old former High Court judge who lived in a Scottish castle to acknowledge institutional racism was quite extraordinary. Am I right in thinking you've been at a Stephen Lawrence event today, Kate?
Yes, that's right, just before I came on here. And it is interesting to hear how, the stories, some of the ones we've touched on, even in America ourselves in this conversation, touch on the history, the intertwined journey that some things appeared to be a polemic moment of change and a significant moment of change, but then things redress and go back and slide again. And we have people like Cressida Dick overseeing the incident on the tube with the Brazilian Jean-Paul Menendez, was it called? And he was shot 7 times in the head because he looked like, to them, to the institutionalized racist police, they shot him because they thought he was an Islamic terrorist and he was a South American. So the kind of degree of ignorance, Cressida Dick oversaw that. She didn't have to resign. She's still there years later, with the Sarah Everard vigil being improperly policed and heavy-handedly policed. And so how do they learn their lessons if there aren't consequences for them on the journey? And I think we've had deaths in police custody up here. Anwar has championed, some of those. And we can't be complacent in Britain, because we definitely do face institutionalized racism. And I hope that, perhaps if some of the candidates in this election get selected and get to Holyrood, those kind of changes are an important way forward, because we need these voices at the decision-making table to persuade the nation's leaders of the directions that we need to go to make things better for everybody. And that's the kind of Scotland that I want to see, an independent Scotland that's fair and just and lawful and proper and isn't corrupt and sleazy and abusing its powers. So
one of the reasons for setting up Stephen Lawrence Day isn't just to remind people of what happened to him, but also to allow local communities to take action and to give a focus to local communities' action against racism, and to give to highlight anti-racism activities. And one of the things that the people behind the Stephen Lawrence Day have said is that they want people to educate themselves about racism. Because you're right, it's very easy for us to think it only happens elsewhere and it doesn't really happen here. And that's particularly true in Scotland, where we have a complacency about racism, where we think it really isn't something that we have to worry about. It's an English thing, it doesn't happen in Scotland. And we know that that's absolutely not true. The institutionalised racism in Britain, as we know, is not a new thing. So the other story that came out today, in fact, was that the Defence Secretary has apologised for Britain's failure to properly commemorate tens of thousands of Black and Asian soldiers who died serving the country, and pledged to explore decolonising schools teaching of the First World War. Ben Wallace said historic failings had been identified in an inquiry set up by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. The inquiry report published today found that up to 54,000 casualties of certain ethnic groups did not receive the same remembrance treatment as white soldiers who had died, and up to another 350,000 military personnel recruited from East Africa and Egypt were not commemorated by name or even at all. That's shocking, Kate. I mean, these are people who died for Britain, who don't have a headstone, whose names are not on any kind of register. They've just disappeared. There was someone at the time, just to, underline the institutionalised racism, said that the average native would not understand or appreciate a headstone. Now, the government have promised to do something about it. It's not entirely sure what they're going to do about it. They're talking about maybe creating monuments. They're certainly talking about fixing the register. But I was really shocked when I heard that. So, I mean,
It's one of
what should they be doing? How should they
I,
redress this?
I think it's one of those things where we're shocked, but we're not surprised. And I think, for me, the whole issue of how we tell our story, what our history is we need to understand the reality of our colonialism in the world. We need to understand British history much more in the round, much more broadly, much more all the bits that have historically been swept under rugs all over the place. And there's this whole thing about his story, and women's history is eradicated, but that's true of almost all marginalized groups. And it is a white male macho thing, our history, and the way it's told and the way it's recognized and the way it's celebrated. And if you dare to speak out against it, you get absolutely abused on social media if you question statues celebrating slave owners, or flags for me are very difficult emblematically. And it's so deep, and so, but the people that perpetuate it understand the power of it. They understand the power of these kind of jingoistic approaches, this kind of, and it triggers people who come out and defend the status quo, so they can fight off challenge and change. And I support all kinds of equalities issues, and I think it's the same in all of them, in that for women's roles and experiences to improve, men need to be participatory in that and to change. For disabled people's life experience, lived experience to improve, non-disabled people have to change. And the same is true for BAME community, for any other LGBTQ, any other minority. Because if you group all the minorities together, we're actually a majority. Women are a majority on our own. There's 52% of us. So
you know what they say: history's written by the winners, and that's the problem.
Absolutely.
That's the problem with
sadly,
history.
we were often the winners, which a great number of our citizens seem to think is fabulous, without questioning the actual harmful realities of that in many communities across the world. So if these people get recognition for this sacrifice in wars, which I'm against anyway, but if this happens, I think maybe it will redress some balance, but I think it will. It just feeds into
the other
the
thing
same
Ben
thing.
Wallace said was that he was going to propose that they waived the visa fee for service personnel from the Commonwealth countries and Nepal if they want to settle in the UK. Maybe waive the visa requirement completely, Mr. Wallace, not just the fee. Anyway, on that note, we've come to the end of the programme. Thank you so much for joining me tonight, Kate. We were touching on some interesting stuff there. We could have gone on. So I hope you'll come back and we can continue these conversations. I hope you've enjoyed the programme tonight. As we always say, it takes money to make programmes on Broadcasting Scotland. If we had 1% of the budget that BBC Scotland had, just think what we could do. You can help towards that. Please think about supporting Broadcasting Scotland. Go onto the website on www.broadcastingscotland.scot/register and see how you can help us continue to make programmes. It's been a pleasure talking to you this evening, and I'll see you on Sunday. Good evening.
Thank you.